If I had to name the 10 most important philosophy papers of the 20th century in terms of their influence on the wider culture, the paper we're discussing today, Peter Singer's Famine, Affluence, and Morality, would be close to the top of that list. It almost single-handedly put global poverty on the map as a serious topic of study for contemporary moral philosophy, and it had a major influence on the emergence, a few decades later, of the so-called effective altruism movement, in which Peter Singer himself plays a major part. Now, before we start discussing the philosophical substance of Singer's article, let's say a few words about the historical context in which Singer's paper was written. What exactly happened in East Bengal in 1971? After the partition of India in 1947 into India and Pakistan, Pakistan consisted of two geographically and culturally separate halves, West Pakistan and East Bengal, later renamed East Pakistan, separated by 1,000 miles of Indian territory. Although the two territories were roughly equal in population, political and economic power resided in the Urdu-speaking West, leading to many grievances in the predominantly Bengali-speaking East. In March 1971, the West Pakistani Army launched the so-called Operation Searchlight, a genocidal campaign to tamp down on East Bengali calls for independence. This produced one of the worst humanitarian crises in modern times. Estimates vary, but somewhere between 300,000 and up to 3 million were killed. As many as 400,000 women were raped. Between 8 and 10 million refugees fled across the border to India, putting a severe strain on resources in India's northeastern provinces. Large-scale famine ensued. So that's the context of humanitarian crisis in which Peter Singer was writing his paper. Now, as he indicates in a footnote in the paper, just as the article was going to press, the Indo-Pakistani War of 1971 led to the creation of an independent Bangladesh. Singer's article was written from a sense of moral outrage at the fact that, in the face of this huge humanitarian catastrophe, the affluent countries in the West were doing relatively little. Although they had the resources and wherewithal to greatly relieve suffering and death in East Bengal and India, only comparatively paltry sums were donated to the governments of these countries or to relief organizations. At the same time, affluent Western countries were spending vastly greater sums on vanity projects such as the Concorde supersonic jet or the Sydney Opera House. Singer sets out in his article to challenge people's sense that this is even remotely morally justifiable. At the same time, Singer is clear that the particular example of the famine in East Bengal was chosen only because it was widely reported at the time. But the same conditions of widespread famine, early disease, and death that for a brief moment seized the headlines during the Bengal crisis of 1971 were in fact endemic in large parts of the developing world. Still, we might wonder, what does this have to do with us today? Well, lest we think of this as a merely historical problem, here are some facts about global poverty today. According to the most recent figures from the World Bank, 2/3 of the world population live on less than $10 per day. In 2015, the last year for which we have reliable data, every 10th person, or roughly 700 million people, lived in extreme poverty, defined as below a threshold of $1.90 a day. Now bear in mind that these figures are calculated at purchasing power parity, meaning that they are already accounting for the fact that costs of living are cheaper in developing countries. 800 million people worldwide do not have enough food to eat. 300 million of them are children. According to the United Nations World Food Programme, hunger is the #1 cause of death in the world, killing more than HIV/AIDS, malaria, and tuberculosis combined. But in addition, 2 million children die from preventable diseases each year, such as diarrhea and pneumonia, because they cannot afford proper treatment. And yet, the amount the developed world spends on alleviating these problems is tiny compared with its wealth. In 2016, net official development assistance from the countries in the OECD Development Assistance Committee was only 0.32% of the combined national income of these countries. Oxfam estimates that it would take $60 billion annually to end extreme poverty, which is less than 1/4 the income of the top 100 richest billionaires. So, despite the very considerable progress that has been made in fighting global poverty over the past half-century, the combination of facts that triggered Peter Singer's moral outrage back in 1971, the dire poverty, deprivation, suffering, and death in large parts of the world, and the relative apathy of people and governments in the developed countries, are still very much in place today. Let us now start examining Singer's article. At the heart of Singer's paper is a very simple but powerful moral argument. You can find it on page 231 of the text. Why don't you get out your copy of the article and let's try and reconstruct Singer's argument together. What we'll do is we'll try and break down Singer's argument into a set of numbered propositions which will capture the key steps of his argument. I'll start us off with the first premise of Singer's argument. It's this: suffering and death from lack of food, shelter, and medical care are bad. Now, this first premise is followed by a second moral principle, which you can also find on page 231 of the paper. Please pause the video and take a moment to see if you can identify it by yourself. All right, here it is. The second premise of Singer's argument is this: if it is in our power to prevent something bad from happening without thereby sacrificing anything of comparable moral importance, we ought morally to do it. Now, for ease of future reference, I'll give a name to this premise. Let us call it Singer's principle. To complete the argument, we need a third factual premise which applies Singer's two normative ideas to the case of global poverty. Now, this premise isn't stated quite as explicitly in the text as the first two ideas, but I think it's fairly clear that Singer also endorses the following factual claim. It is in our power to prevent something bad from happening by helping the poor receive food, shelter, and medical care, without thereby sacrificing anything of comparable moral importance. And from these three premises, we get the argument's conclusion. Therefore, we ought to prevent suffering and death by helping the poor receive food, shelter, and medical care. So, Singer's argument stated in full runs like this. First premise: suffering and death from lack of food, shelter, and medical care are bad. Second premise: if it is in our power to prevent something bad from happening without thereby sacrificing anything of comparable moral importance, we ought morally to do it. Third premise: it is in our power to prevent something bad from happening by helping the poor receive food, shelter, and medical care without thereby sacrificing anything of comparable moral importance. Conclusion: therefore, we ought to prevent suffering and death by helping the poor receive food, shelter, and medical care. Now, in doing this first pass analysis of Singer's argument, I've been using a couple of technical philosophical terms like premise, conclusion, and so on. And because for many of you this is your first time doing philosophy, let's be completely clear about what we mean by these terms. So why don't we briefly take a step back and ask, what exactly is a moral argument? In fact, let's ask an even more basic question. What is an argument? Well, an argument is a set of connected propositions or premises which together are supposed to entail a conclusion. Another technical term. What does entail mean? Well, entailment is a term of logic. A set of propositions together entail a conclusion if they can't all be true without the conclusion being true as well. An argument in which the premises do entail the conclusion is called a logically valid argument. That is, it is an argument where if the premises are true, the conclusion must be true as well. The argument, we say, has a valid logical form, that is, truth-preserving. If all the premises, that is, the starting assumptions of the argument are true, then its conclusion has to be true as well. Of course, if one or more of the premises are false, then even a valid argument can lead us to a false conclusion. Here's one example. Consider the following argument. First premise. If a number is a prime number, then it is only divisible by itself and 1. Second premise. The number 8 is a prime number. Conclusion, therefore, the number 8 is only divisible by itself and 1. Now, this argument is logically valid. If its premises were both true, its conclusion would have to be true as well. But of course, the premises of the argument aren't both true. 8 is not a prime number. Philosophers have a second technical term for an argument that is valid and which contains only true premises. We call such an argument a sound argument. The conclusion of a sound argument is by definition true, since it's an argument whose conclusion has to be true if all its premises are true, and all its premises are, in fact, true. And of course, ultimately, when we're doing philosophy, we're interested in determining whether the arguments we're examining are not just valid, but also whether they are sound. Now, in moral philosophy, which is what we're engaged in this class, arguments are often made up of one or more moral principles and one or more empirical or factual premises which apply these general moral principles to a given case. So let's see how this works in Singer's argument. Which premises of Singer's argument state moral principles and which are factual premises? Let's look at each of the premises in turn. So here's the first premise. Suffering and death from lack of food and shelter and medical care are bad. Does this state a moral or an empirical claim? Take a moment to think of your answer. Well, if you answered that the premise states a moral claim, then congratulations, that's correct. To say that suffering and death from lack of food, shelter, and medical care are bad is clearly to engage in moral evaluation. Let's look at the second premise. If it is in our power to prevent something bad from happening without thereby sacrificing anything of comparable moral importance, we ought morally to do it. Again, pause the video and take a moment to figure out for yourself whether this premise makes a moral or an empirical claim. Again, the answer is that this premise makes a moral claim. It's a statement not about what is empirically the case, but about what we ought morally to do. Okay, finally, let's look at premise 3. It is in our power to prevent something bad from happening by helping the poor receive food, shelter, and medical care, without thereby sacrificing anything of comparable moral importance. Now, this is an empirical premise. It states a matter of empirical fact. Given the prevailing distribution of money and resources in the world and the relevant facts about global poverty, it is in our power to help the poor receive food, shelter, and medical care without thereby sacrificing anything of comparable importance. So I've gone through this little exercise of breaking Singer's argument down into numbered propositions at some length because I think that this is in fact one of the most helpful techniques when trying to analyze a complicated philosophical text. In the future, when reading a philosophy paper, try to do this yourself. Try to reconstruct the argument the author is making by breaking it down as a series of numbered propositions. I think it's an excellent way to check the argument's logical validity, to clarify what its key claims are, and to see at what points an argument might be challenged or resisted. Now, if we had to identify the premise in Singer's argument that's doing the heavy lifting, which one is that? Well, in fact, which one does Singer himself highlight? The answer is that it's Singer's principle. In fact, Singer says that he won't even engage people who deny the first moral premise, that suffering and death from lack of food, shelter, and medical care are bad. There's simply not much left to say to someone who denies such a basic moral idea. Likewise, the empirical premise that it's in our power to prevent something bad from happening without thereby sacrificing anything of comparable moral importance, this is also largely taken for granted in this paper. Now, it's not that this empirical claim is obvious or incontestable. Rather, it's not the place of philosophy as a discipline to rule on such matters of empirical fact. For that, we have social sciences like economics, epidemiology, health policy, and so on. For what it's worth, though, I'll just mention in support of premise 3 that the effective altruist organization, Giving What We Can, estimates that by donating just 10% of their income to the most effective charities, the average American could save approximately 25 lives over the course of their working lives. All right, so we've said the key moral claim in Singer's article is his principle that if it is in our power to prevent something bad from happening without thereby sacrificing anything of comparable moral importance, we ought morally to do it. Let's now examine this principle a little more closely. I'll begin by comparing Singer's principle to a view that we encountered in our last class, namely act consequentialism. As a reminder, act consequentialism is the view that an action is right if and only if its consequences are at least as good as those of any alternative possible action in that situation. Now, I want to know, how does Singer's principle relate to act consequentialism? Are these two principles saying the same thing, or are there differences? Now, before we can answer that, we first need to know what exactly Singer means by the clause without sacrificing anything of comparable moral importance. And again, the answer is right in the text on page 231. He means, quote, without causing anything else comparably bad to happen, or doing something that is wrong in itself, or failing to promote some moral good, comparable in significance to the bad thing that we can prevent, end quote. Okay, so back to our question. Are Singer's principle and act consequentialism equivalent, or are there differences? Well, I think we can characterize the relationship of the two principles this way. Everyone who accepts act consequentialism is committed to accepting Singer's principle as well. By contrast, we can accept Singer's principle without accepting act consequentialism. Think about it this way. Act consequentialism tells us to maximize the good. Now, in a situation where it is in our power to prevent something bad from happening without thereby sacrificing anything of comparable moral importance, preventing that bad thing from happening is what maximizes the good. So act consequentialism entails the truth of Singer's principle. On the other hand, Singer's principle does not entail the truth of act consequentialism. It's a considerably weaker principle. For one thing, unlike act consequentialism, which holds that the rightness of an action is exclusively a function of the goodness of its consequences, Singer's principle expressly allows that some action might be wrong in itself, even though it does produce good consequences. Remember a case from last lecture, the organ harvesting case. It is compatible with Singer's principle, but not with act consequentialism, to say that even if killing the healthy patient and harvesting her organs would produce the best possible consequences in that scenario, because 5 lives will be saved, it would nonetheless be wrong to do so, because killing an innocent person as a means to saving 5 others is just wrong in itself. Okay, second difference. Unlike act consequentialism, Singer's principle does not rule out the possibility of there being actions that are supererogatory, i.e., above and beyond the call of duty. Recall the grenade case from last lecture. Now, given the facts of the case, the action that maximizes the good here is for the soldier to sacrifice his own life in order to save 5 others. For the act consequentialist, this is enough to make it morally required of the soldier to sacrifice himself. By contrast, accepting only Singer's principle would not commit us to this conclusion. Singer's principle, recall, says that if it is in our power to prevent something bad from happening without thereby sacrificing anything of comparable moral importance, we ought morally to do it. But laying down his own life, we might think, is a sacrifice of comparable moral importance for the soldier. It's comparable to the bad thing that he could prevent, 5 other people losing their lives. So the condition of Singer's principle, if it's in our power to prevent something bad from happening without thereby sacrificing anything of comparable moral importance, arguably isn't satisfied in this case. So to summarize, while anyone who accepts act consequentialism is committed to also accepting Singer's principle, the reverse is not the case. Singer's principle is a logically weaker idea than act consequentialism. Okay, but now I'll let you in on a little secret. Peter Singer is actually a convinced consequentialist. If you go up to him and ask, Professor Singer, what's the theory of morality which you are persuaded is correct? His response will be, some form of the consequentialist theory. But that raises a question. Why, if Singer is actually a consequentialist, does he base his argument on Singer's principle, which is a weaker claim, and not directly on act consequentialism, which is a stronger claim? Well, I believe the reason is this. All else equal, a philosophical argument is more powerful the less controversial and the more widely accepted its premises are. That way, at least provided the argument is logically valid, its conclusions are harder to deny. Now, Singer's objective in this paper is to establish that it's morally imperative that we get serious about the problem of global poverty. He could argue for this conclusion by assuming the truth of act consequentialism, but that's a pretty controversial doctrine that many people reject. Or he could argue for this same conclusion by assuming the truth of Singer's principle, a much weaker and less controversial idea. So in the interest of making his argument as appealing and as persuasive to the largest possible audience, Singer chooses to go the latter route. Now, I think that there's an important lesson here for all of us about how to write good philosophy papers. To make your paper as persuasive as possible to as many people as possible, it is better, all else equal, to base your arguments on premises that are as widely shared and as uncontroversial as possible. Okay, let's move on. There are 2 features of Singer's principle that are worthy of note, I think. The first is that it takes no account of proximity or distance. As Singer puts it in his paper, quote, "It makes no moral difference whether the person I can help is a neighbor's child 10 yards from me or a Bengali whose name I shall never know 10,000 miles away." Nor does his principle see any morally relevant difference between cases where I am, in fact, the only one who could prevent some great evil from occurring, and cases where there are many others who could also help. As Singer puts it, the fact that millions of other people who could also give are doing nothing makes it no more defensible for myself to do nothing. It might make me feel less guilty, but the inaction of others can't justify my own inaction. Now, because Singer embraces these 2 features of his principle, the moral irrelevance of distance and the moral irrelevance of whether or not others could also be helping, he's in a position to argue that the question whether or not to rescue distant needy strangers in need is in all morally relevant respects just like the question whether or not to rescue the life of a person right in front of you, provided, of course, that you could do so at a comparatively small sacrifice. So this brings us to probably the most famous part of Singer's article, his thought experiment of the drowning child. But instead of having me narrate this case for you, why don't we listen to Peter Singer himself?
About 30 years ago, I wrote an article called Famine, Affluence and Morality, in which I imagined that you're walking past a shallow pond, and as you walk past it, you notice that there's a small child who's fallen into the pond and seems to be in danger of drowning. And you look around to see where the parents are, and there's nobody in sight. You realise that unless you wade into this pond and pull the child out, the child is likely to drown. There's no danger to you because you know the pond is just a shallow one, but you are wearing a nice pair of shoes and they're probably going to get ruined if you wade into that shallow pond. So, of course, when I ask people this, they always say, well, of course, forget about the shoes. You've just got to save the child. That's clear. And then I stop and say, okay, well, I agree with you about that. But for the price of a pair of shoes, if you were to give that to Oxfam or UNICEF or one of those organisations, they could probably save the life of a child, maybe more than one child, in a poor country where children are dying because they can't get basic medical care to treat very basic diseases like diarrhea or whatever else it might be. And that's really one of the reasons why I think it's interesting to be here on Fifth Avenue talking about ethics, because ethics is about the basic choices that we ought to make in our lives. And one of those choices is, how do we spend our money?
So that's Singer's famous thought experiment, from the horse's mouth. Now, as I was saying, the drowning child in Singer's example is physically proximate, whereas the starving poor in Bangladesh are many thousands of miles removed from us. Moreover, in the case of the drowning child, I am the only one who can save its life by assumption. In contrast, the life of a starving Bangladeshi refugee could, in principle, be saved by anyone willing to donate to a relief organization like Oxfam. But as we've just seen, according to Singer, neither of these differences is morally relevant. The pond case therefore gives Singer another way of arguing for his desired conclusion, namely by means of an argument from analogy. This argument would go as follows. First premise: it would be morally wrong not to save the life of a child drowning in a shallow pond. Second premise: there is in fact no morally relevant difference between failing to save the life of a distant stranger, dying as a result of poverty, and not saving the child drowning in the shallow pond. Conclusion: therefore, it is morally wrong not to save the life of distant strangers dying as a result of poverty. Now, an argument from analogy only succeeds if the analogy is indeed a good one. So it pays to ask, are the case of the drowning child and the problem of global poverty really alike in all morally relevant respects? Or are there perhaps some morally relevant differences between these cases that Singer has overlooked? We'll devote part of this Thursday's town hall to this question, so give it some thought ahead of time. Today, I want to comment on one difference between the cases that strikes me as salient. The case of the drowning child is one-off, we might say. There's only one child drowning. You have to decide whether to pull this child from the pond, sacrificing your shoes in the process, but then you're done. There are no further children in the pond, and no further sacrifices are asked of you in this situation. By contrast, there are literally millions of strangers in developing countries in dire need of assistance. Once you've saved the life of the first distant stranger, there's another life that you can save. Even if you devoted your entire life to saving them, you wouldn't get to the bottom of the problem. Now, applied to such an iterated scenario, Singer's principle quickly becomes very demanding indeed. Once you've saved the first needy stranger, a second opportunity to save a life presents itself, and again you must ask, would I need to sacrifice anything of comparable moral importance if I save this life? If the answer to this question is no, you ought to save the second life as well, at further personal sacrifice, and so on and so forth. The fact that you have already saved a life in the past is neither here nor there, according to Singer's principle. The principle is purely forward-looking. What matters is solely whether, going forward, you could save another life without thereby sacrificing anything of comparable moral importance. It is now that we see the genuinely radical upshot of Singer's principle. Taken to its logical conclusion, the principle requires you to go on sacrificing in order to save lives right up to the point of marginal utility, where the marginal cost to you or to others, say family members, of saving a further life exceeds the marginal benefit of doing so. So this makes Singer's principle very demanding. It would require you to reduce your level of well-being and that of your family close to that of the global poor. So the implications of Singer's argument, if true, are revolutionary. Traditionally, many people have viewed charitable giving as morally optional. It's something that is nice and praiseworthy to do, but not something that is morally required of you. By contrast, if Singer is right, aiding others in severe need, either by giving to charitable organizations or collectively through foreign development aid, is not morally optional for the citizens of wealthy countries. It is our moral duty. But more than that, the extent of charitable giving that is morally required of us, affluent citizens of developed countries, goes far beyond what has traditionally been assumed, even by religious practices such as tithing, which did regard charity as a moral obligation. For Singer, as long as severe poverty and deprivation exists in the world, we shouldn't rest content with donating just some relatively modest fraction of our income and wealth. We should keep on giving until poverty has been eradicated, or we've almost exhausted our resources. Now, a view this radical is bound to call forth opposition. And in the remainder of today's lecture, I want to take a look at two of the most common strands of philosophical resistance to Singer's argument in Famine, Affluence, and Morality. The first of these picks up on the feature of Singer's view that we've just highlighted, namely the extremely demanding implications that his principle can have. Some philosophers hold that a view as demanding as Singer's, and a fortiori as demanding as act consequentialism, is simply implausible. They give a variety of possible reasons for this claim. A moral view like Singer's principle or act consequentialism, they say, leaves us too little moral freedom. We're only free to choose amongst the actions that have the best consequences. But it's not plausible that our freedom of choice should be so constrained by morality. Second, some claim that extremely demanding moral views like act consequentialism or Singer's principle are too psychologically burdensome because their requirements are often strongly opposed to our inclinations and desires. And more than that, trying to live our lives by the tenets of these ethical codes, these philosophers argue, would be deeply alienating. It would require us to constantly check and second-guess some of our deepest and most valuable inclinations, such as the inclination to help a friend in need, even when this is not necessarily the most effective or optimistic use of our time and resources. Finally, it is claimed, such views leave too little room for legitimate self-interest and are implausible because they allow the agent too little room to cultivate personal attachments to their near and dear, like family members, countrymen, or to cherished projects of the kind that require time and devotion, but which make life worth living. Now, you can find many of these sentiments echoed in the piece by Amiya Srinivasan that I put on the syllabus as optional supplementary reading for today. And in any event, we'll encounter them again in the coming weeks when reading the texts by Michael Stocker and Bernard Williams. Now, Singer is well aware of these possible challenges to his view, but I think he would reply along two lines. First, Singer readily admits that the demands of his principle and of consequentialism are potentially extreme. But this, to his mind, is a feature, not a bug, of his view. Singer's principle makes extreme demands on us because the circumstances are extreme. Global poverty is a dire problem, and it shouldn't come as a surprise that sometimes extreme circumstances call for extreme sacrifices. But there's a second point. The demands of Singer's principle are in fact only extreme because most people are doing nothing or close to nothing to address the problem of global poverty. If all people decided to give to charitable organizations, or if governments raised their foreign aid budgets, the demands per person would in fact be quite moderate. But while this second point may be an effective rejoinder against the first family of objections to Singer's principle, objections that it is too demanding, I think it might lead Singer straight into the arms of a second line of critique. According to the philosopher Liam Murphy and his book Moral Demands in Non-Ideal Theory, the central objection to act consequentialism and to Singer's principle is not that these views are too demanding, but that they are, in a sense, unfair. It's a notable feature of both act consequentialism and of Singer's principle that they require you to pick up the slack for other people's non-compliance. Singer, after all, makes no distinction between, on the one hand, cases where something bad will happen unless you make a great sacrifice, because you are the only one who could prevent the bad outcome. The pond case is an example of that. And on the other hand, cases where something bad will happen unless you make a great sacrifice, because other people who could help are not in fact doing so. But that, Murphy thinks, is profoundly unfair. It makes our duties of beneficence hostage to other people's bad behavior. Because you are not doing your bit, I am required to do more. Now, to avoid being held hostage to other people's non-compliance in this way, Murphy suggests that we should derive our moral obligations of beneficence under conditions of partial compliance from what our moral obligations would be under conditions of full compliance. In other words, he defends what is known in the literature as a fair share view. As Murphy himself puts the view, in situations of partial compliance, the sacrifice each agent is required to make is limited to the level of sacrifice that would be optimal, or her fair share, if the situation were one of full compliance. Of the actions that require no more than this level of sacrifice, agents are required to perform the action that makes the outcome best. Now, applied to the problem of global poverty, this means that the amount that I, as an individual, should donate to a relief organization like Oxfam is what would have constituted my fair share contribution to help solve the problem of global poverty in a scenario where everyone else was likewise motivated to donate. But while it succeeds in capturing many people's sense that it is unfair that they be asked to pick up the slack for the non-compliance of others, Murphy's fair share view is not without problems of its own. To see that, consider the following case. Let's call it the case of 10 drowning children. So imagine that 10 children are drowning in a shallow pond. You and 9 other bystanders could save them by throwing them life jackets. Now, your fair share of the rescue under full compliance is to throw 1 life jacket. Let's suppose that there's some small material sacrifice that you have to make for each life jacket that you throw. However, the other 9 potential rescuers are doing nothing. They just walk away. What ought you to do? Murphy's fair share view suggests that what you're required to do in the face of partial non-compliance by other would-be rescuers is no more than what would have been your fair share in a full compliance scenario. That is, to throw 1 life jacket. But can that really be right? Can you really throw 1 life jacket and then wipe your hands of the affair? To many, that doesn't seem right at all. Even though it was wrong for the other rescuers to walk away and leave you to deal with the problem, the fact remains that, at relatively moderate extra cost to yourself, you could save another 9 children from drowning. Shouldn't you just suck it up and shoulder that burden? So perhaps the upshot is that, while it is unfair that you are morally required to pick up the slack for others, it is nonetheless the case that you morally ought to. Morality and the non-compliance of others can together conspire to create situations where you are morally required to shoulder an unfair burden. Let me end this lecture with a little update on Peter Singer's views on poverty and charitable giving. Because in the almost 50 years that have elapsed since Singer's Famine, Affluence, and Morality came out, he's continued to publish on this topic, most recently his book, The Life You Can Save, 2009. And what is notable is that in his more recent works, Singer no longer highlights the radical implications of his principle. Instead, he now publicly calls for a much more moderate new standard of giving, which says the following: people in the affluent countries should give at least 1% of their net income, although Singer does say that this percentage might increase as one's income increases as well. Does this mean that Singer has lost confidence in the principle that was at the heart of his argument in Famine, Affluence, and Morality? No. As a matter of fact, Singer continues to believe this principle to be true. Instead, he justifies his decision to publicly promote a far more moderate standard by saying that, although we ought to give much more, it's not practical to demand that people do so. Indeed, doing so might have counterproductive consequences and may turn people off from giving anything at all. So, in his recent work, Singer emphasizes the importance of being pragmatic when it comes to getting as much money as possible to the poor, even if that means holding people to lower standards as a means of changing their habits. Singer is here following in a venerable consequentialist tradition, going back to the 19th century utilitarian Henry Sidgwick, which consists in applying consequentialist principles and reasoning to the public promotion of morality itself. On this view, sometimes it is best to keep the moral truth hidden, or esoteric, as Sidgwick puts it. The moral codes that we should publicly promote, as standards for people to live by, are those whose public promotion will do the most good. But sometimes, in the interest of producing the best consequences, we shouldn't speak the full truth about morality. Or at least, we shouldn't speak it too loudly.